wisdom in the New Testament. So wisdom literature very much has its place in the canon of the Old Testament, both Catholic and Protestant, but perhaps a little more prominently in the Catholic canon. But we see it in the New Testament as well. So we have one book that's dedicated to wisdom literature, and that's the book of James. But the book of James, interestingly, just seems to reflect a lot of Jesus's teachings. They're not maybe explicitly cited or quoted as though coming from him, but they're just sort of imbued with what he would say. So my focus for the rest of this presentation will be on Jesus's own wisdom teachings in the Gospels as kind of informing wisdom literature, but also, and more importantly, informing the Franciscan vision. So we know that St. Francis modeled his life after the teachings and way of Jesus. And Jesus is very much operating within this wisdom worldview as well. So when we look for this wisdom tradition in the New Testament, we find it in a few places. Essentially, though, Jesus' teachings in the Gospels. So Jesus is portrayed as a teacher of wisdom. And how is this conveyed exactly? So I'm going to focus on the Synoptic Gospels, mostly of Matthew and Luke. But there's a number of ways this comes through. So first we have this material that is more obviously recognized as wisdom material. So first there's Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. And in this sermon, this is probably his most famous teachings. We have the Beatitudes, things that are very well known. But generally, we see a collection of material that very much is reminiscent of wisdom material as we know it from the Old Testament. He offers short sayings that are similar to aphorisms and resemble traditional wisdom proverbs. They also tend to be very down to earth and oriented towards practical action. Additionally, we'll see his instructions are geared towards love of neighbor. There's a radical emphasis on this, and it's even extended to enemies. We also have Luke's Sermon on the Plain. So Luke's Sermon on the Plain shares a lot of material with the Sermon on the Mount. So again, it's very characteristic of sort of wisdom teachings. Then we also have these wisdom discourses sort of interspersed throughout the Gospels. And these would be smaller sections where we kind of get a block of Jesus's teaching, which very much tends to resemble wisdom literature. So we also have the Gospels, interestingly, sort of characterizing Jesus as being full of wisdom. And this is significant Christologically as well, since in the Old Testament, we saw this emphasis on identifying wisdom with God. God is the source of wisdom. So we have from the Gospel of Mark, this saying early on in his ministry. On the Sabbath, he begins to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands?" And then in Matthew, we have him borrowing from Mark. Jesus came to his hometown and began to teach the people in their synagogue, so that they were astounded and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these deeds of power?" So again, this clear association between Jesus and wisdom. Jesus is portrayed as someone who possesses wisdom. And then in Luke, we have two sort of comments about how Jesus is full of wisdom. Early on, we have the child, Jesus, grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. And then similarly, Jesus increases in wisdom and in years, and in divine and human favor. So we see this emphasis in the three synoptic gospels, and it's in John as well, on how Jesus is full of wisdom, and thus has the authority to teach in this way. But it also characterizes him as a wisdom teacher.